When you picture surviving a prairie winter in 1880, you think about firewood. How many cords? How far to haul it? How fast the stove burns through a split of cottonwood when the temperature drops below zero. Every neighbor, every old hand, every man who had lived through a hard season would tell you the same thing: stack more wood. But the thing that killed people on the open plains was not the cold itself, it was the wind. A still cabin at 20 below holds its heat. A cabin in a 30-mile-an-hour gust gives the heat back as fast as the stove can make it. The problem was never fuel, it was speed. One woman understood this before her first winter on the claim. The claim sat 8 miles west of Beatrice in Gage County, Nebraska, and the woman who owned it had been a widow for 2 months. Marit Tveit arrived in late September of 1880 with a handcart, 2 children, and the kind of silence that comes after a man dies badly. Her husband, Oddmund, had cut his own thigh with a scythe in July. The wound turned black within a week. He was buried in a shallow plot behind the sod church before the corn tasseled. Marit was 31 years old. She had 160 acres of treeless prairie, a 14 by 18-foot claim cabin with a single finished sod windbank on the south side, and a cracked sheet iron stove that ate fuel the way fire eats paper, fast and without gratitude. She owned 1 milk goat, 2 iron pots, a sack of flour, a sack of cornmeal, 120 pounds of potatoes, and $29.60 folded into a piece of oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk. She had less than 1 cord of cottonwood stacked against the cabin wall. Winter in Gage County required 5 cords minimum, 6 if the wind came from the northwest, which it did more years than not. She could not leave. Oddman had taken a $12 debt note from a cattleman named Wade Chisholm to pay for roof beams the previous spring. If Marit relinquished the claim, the sale would cover Chisholm's note and nothing else. She would walk into Beatrice with 2 children, no money, and no husband's name to borrow against. The Homestead Act allowed a widow to hold her husband's claim, but holding it meant surviving on it, and surviving on it meant wintering on a bald prairie with a leaking cabin, a hungry stove, and 4 cords of wood she did not have. Randy was 9. Tulif was 6. They did not yet understand what their father's death had cost in arithmetic. They understood it in the sound their mother made at night when she thought they were sleeping, a low, pressed breathing, like someone carrying a weight up a hill that had no top. The north wall was the worst of it. Oddman had never finished the sod banking on that side. Wind came through the gaps between the rough-cut boards like water through a sieve, and in September it was only an annoyance. By December, it would be a killing thing. Marit stuffed rags into the largest cracks and felt the prairie pull them loose within hours. She pressed her palm flat against the north boards on a windy afternoon and felt the heat leave her hand in 3 seconds. She counted. 1, 2, 3, and the warmth was gone. She needed 2 more roof beams to replace the one sagging over the west corner. She needed chinking for the north wall. She needed hay for the goat and a winter cover for the hay. She needed storm shutters. She needed a team and a wagon to haul wood from the creek bottom 7 miles south. She did not have a team. She did not have a wagon. She had a handcart with 1 cracked wheel spoke. The mathematics of her survival did not work. She ran the numbers the way her father had taught her to run numbers, while on a board with a nail, scratching figures into soft pine, and every version ended the same way. She was short on fuel, short on shelter, short on time, and short on every kind of help that cost money. Orrin Phelps came on the 4th day. He was 58, a former freighter who had hauled goods across the Platte when Marit was still a girl in Norway, and he served now as the township road overseer. He walked the property the way a man walks a horse he's deciding not to buy, slowly with his jaw set, looking for the thing that confirms what he already believes. He tapped the north wall with his cane. The boards gave a hollow sound. He looked at the sod windbank on the south side and said nothing. He counted the cottonwood in the stack and shook his head. "You have a house that leaks," Orrin said. "You have a stove that eats fuel, and you have a prairie that gives the wind a running start from the Dakotas to your door, with nothing in between to slow it down." Marit stood with her hands in her apron. Randy held a cracked slate behind her mother's skirt. Tollef sat on the flour sack and watched the old man the way children watch storms, not understanding the danger, only sensing the size. Orrin listed what a proper winter place needed: sod banking to the window line on 3 sides, hay stacked against the north wall and covered with canvas, storm shutters, heavy ones, not the crate-board she had leaned against the window frame, 6 cords of wood, split and stacked and dry, and a team to haul it because no woman with a handcart was dragging cottonwood 7 miles over frozen ground. "What does 1 cord cost delivered?" Marit asked. Orrin looked at her as if the question itself was the problem. $3.75 if the roads hold, $5 after first snow, more if the hauler has to cut it himself. Marit did the arithmetic and stopped before the children could hear the total. 5 cords at $3.75 was $18.75. She had $29.60. After fuel, she would have $10.85 to last from October through April. No flour, no cornmeal, no boots for Tollef when his feet grew, no lamp oil, no salt. And that was if the roads held. If they did not, 5 cords at $5 was $25, and she would be left with $4.60 and a winter that lasted 5 months. "You need a hired man," Orrin said. "I cannot pay a hired man." "Then you need kin." "I have no kin in Nebraska." Orrin looked at the children. He looked at the north wall. He looked at the single cord of cottonwood and the cracked stovepipe and the goat tied to a stake in grass that was already turning brown. He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Tveet," he said, "I have seen winter take people who had more than you have now. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because I would rather you hear it from me than learn it from the wind." He left without offering to help. Marit did not blame him. He had told the truth as he understood it, and the truth as he understood it was that she was going to fail. Wade Chisholm arrived the next afternoon. He rode a bay horse and wore a coat that had never been mended. He was 42, a cattleman who ran stock on open range north of the claim, and he wanted Marit's quarter section the way a man wants a gate, not for the land itself, but for what it opened. Her 160 acres sat between his summer pasture and his winter grazing. If he owned it, his cattle could cross freely. If she held it, they could not. Chisholm tied his horse to the handcart and walked to where Marit was digging a shallow trench for the goat's winter shelter. He did not remove his hat. "Mrs. Tveet," he said, "I am sorry about Odmund. He was a steady man." Marit kept digging. The shovel bit into dry sod and came up with dust. "I came to offer you a fair price," Chisholm said. $40 for relinquishment rights. You can go back to sewing in town. The children can go to school. You do not have to do this." Marit looked at the shovel blade. $40 would pay Chisholm's own $12 debt note and leave her $28. $28 and 2 children and no claim and no husband and winter coming. "No," she said. Chisholm shifted his weight. "I am trying to help you. You are trying to buy a quarter section for $40. He looked at the cabin, the north wall, the single cord of wood. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved the way a man's eyes move when he is recalculating, adjusting, finding the next angle. The offer stands through October, he said. After that, it drops. He rode out without looking back. Marit watched him go and felt the shovel handle press against the new blisters on her palm. She had refused the only money anyone had offered. She had refused it because $40 was an insult, and because taking it meant proving every man in Gage County right, that a woman alone could not hold a claim, could not face a winter, could not stand where her dead husband had stood and keep standing. But refusal was not a plan. Refusal was only a closed door, and behind that door the same numbers waited. Less than one cord, 2960, 2 children, 5 months of wind. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. The first hard blow came in early October, a northwest wind that crossed the open prairie with nothing to slow it for 40 miles. Marit had stuffed prairie hay into the north wall cracks 2 days earlier, packing it tight with a stick, pressing it into every gap she could find. The wind stripped the hay out in less than an hour. She found clumps of it scattered across the cabin floor, mixed with snow dust that had no business being inside a house. Tolef cried because the snow had settled on his blanket. Randy pulled the blanket off and shook it near the stove, and the snow melted into dark spots on the wool. Marit heated a flat iron on the stove plate and held it near the north wall. She watched the heat leave the iron where the draft crossed the metal. She could feel the warmth bending, curving away from the wall and streaming toward the stovepipe, pulled by the current of cold air that ran along the floor and up through the gaps. The wall was not the problem. The wall was only the place where the problem arrived. The problem was everything between the wall and the horizon. 40 miles of open, flat, treeless prairie that let the wind build speed the way a river builds speed in a canyon. By the time the air hit her cabin, it had been running for an hour. And running air does not just carry cold, it carries cold fast. That night, after the children slept, Marit sat with her back against the south wall, the finished wall, the one with the sod bank, and felt the difference. The south wall was still, not warm, but still. The air on that side did not move. The sod outside had slowed the wind, broken its force, made the air lie down before it touched the boards. She remembered Norway, not the country, not the mountains, not the fjord, a specific afternoon when she was 9 years old, standing beside her mother in the yard behind their house near Voss. Her mother was packing snow against a stone cellar wall with a flat wooden blade while sheep tallow candles smoked inside. Marit's mother had said something that Marit had filed away the way children file away things that sound important but are not yet useful. She had said that wind steals heat faster than frost. She had said that still air is warm air, even when it is cold. Then her mother had taken Marit's hand and pressed her palm against the lee side of a woven willow hurdle, one of the panels her father used to shelter newborn lambs in spring. On the windward side, the air cut like a blade. On the lee side, the air sat. It did not move. It was cold, but it was not stealing anything. Marit pressed her palm against the south wall of the cabin and felt the same thing. Still air, quiet air, air that let the stove do its work instead of robbing it. She did not need more wood. She needed less wind. The question was how to make less wind on a prairie that had none of the stone walls, none of the hills, and none of the forest that Norway used to break the air. 3 days later, Marit walked to Beatrice to buy salt and 4 pounds of nails. Behind the seed and feed store, she saw something she had not noticed before. A nursery wagon sat half unloaded in the lot, and beside it, bundles of thorny branch cuttings lay in a heap like discarded bones. The thorns were long and curved and hard as iron nails. The bark was rough and bright. Each cutting was 2 to 3 feet long, with root stubs at the base and buds along the stem that had dried but not died. She bent and picked one up. The thorns pricked through her gloves. She turned it in her hand, feeling the weight, the density of the wood, the way the branches forked and tangled against each other. Osage Orange, said a voice behind her. Hedge apple, bodark, whatever name you want for it. Burnt Asen was 64 years old. He had spent 11 years as a railroad section hand, 3 years as a nursery laborer near Beatrice, and the rest of his life doing work that left marks on his hands, but not in any record book. He was thin the way old men are thin when they have worked more than they have eaten, and his eyes had the flat, patient quality of a man who had watched other people make mistakes for so long that he no longer felt the need to point them out. He was standing beside the nursery wagon with a hickory-handled dibble in one hand, watching Marit examine the thorns. "You plant these?" Marit asked. "Planted them for 10 years. Hedge fences from Beatrice to the Blue River. Every farmer who wanted to keep cattle in and neighbors out ordered 1,000 whips and set them 6 inches to 3 feet apart, depending on how much patience he had. For fences. For fences. For windbreaks. For posts after barbed wire came in, and nobody needed a live-in fence anymore." He looked at her. "You wanting cattle fence?" Marit shook her head. She held the cutting against the wind and felt the air split around the thorns, and she said the thing that changed everything between them. "I want a wind fence, something that makes the storm spend itself before it reaches my door." Burnt studied her. He did not smile. He did not nod. He tested her with a question. "Fence or wind?" Marit understood the question. "A fence blocks. A windbreak changes direction. They are not the same thing." "Both, if it lives," she said. "Wind first, if it doesn't." Burnt set the dibble down. He picked up 3 sticks from the ground, 1 flat board, 1 loose twig, 1 forked branch with cross pieces. He stuck them upright in the dirt, 6 inches apart. Then he threw a handful of chaff at each one. The flat board caught the chaff on the windward side and threw a swirl behind it. The chaff spun, rose, and dropped in a messy heap against the back of the board. The loose twig let the chaff through. Most of it sailed past and landed 3 feet behind. The forked branch with cross pieces caught some of the chaff, let some through, and dropped it in a clean line on the lee side. No swirl, no mess, a clean deposit. "A solid wall makes a fight," Barrett said. "A loose row makes nothing. A staggered row with the right density makes the wind lay down its load and keep walking." He looked at her. "You understand what I'm saying?" Marit stared at the chaff lines in the dirt. She saw the cabin. She saw the north wall. She saw the 40 miles of open prairie, and she saw what belonged between the prairie and her door. Not a wall, not a fence. A place where the wind had to slow down and drop what it carried. 3 rows, she said. "Staggered." Burnt's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Where?" "Not at the cabin. The drift has to land before it reaches the house, 75 feet out, maybe 90, upwind." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You measure before you dig. That is why I am still standing here." The design took shape that afternoon, drawn in the dirt behind the feed store with a stick. The visible thorn apron would begin 30 feet from the cabin, close enough to mark the protected yard, stop animals, and hold brush. But the real windward catch would run in a north and west arc, 75 to 90 feet from the house, with 3 staggered rows. Rows would stand 4 feet apart. Whips would be set 18 inches apart within each row. Dead thorn brush woven through the lower 3 feet would serve as a temporary winter density layer while the living roots established. The northwestern corner would be doubled because winter winds would strike hardest there. Burnt explained the principle through materials, not lecture. He held a piece of burlap and blew through it. The air slowed but passed. He held a board and blew at it. The air bounced back. He crumpled the burlap into a loose ball and blew at it. The air died inside the fabric. 50 to 60% density, he said. That is the number. Not too thick, not too thin. You want the hedge to catch snow and lay it down in a ridge before it reaches you. Too solid and the wind curls over the top and drops the snow on your roof. Too open and the snow flies straight through. Marit asked what the whips cost. Burnt said the nursery had surplus 2- and 3-year stock that nobody had ordered. $7.10 for enough to fill the ark, if she could haul them herself. She would also need $2 for borrowed wagon time to move the bundles to the claim. $9.10. She had $29.60. After whips and wagon, she would have $20.50. After 5 cords of wood at $3.75 each. But she stopped herself. She would not be buying 5 cords. That was the whole point. The hedge was supposed to reduce the wind, which would reduce the heat loss, which would reduce the fuel she needed. If it worked. If it did not work, she would have spent $9 and 8 days of labor that should have gone toward cutting, hauling, and splitting wood. She would be weaker, poorer, and shorter on fuel than if she had never picked up that thorny cutting behind the feed store. Burnt watched her run the numbers. He did not offer reassurance. He said, I have seen hedges hold drifts 6 feet deep along railroad cuts. I have also seen hedges planted wrong that buried the track under snow that would have blown clear on open ground. The difference is spacing, density, and setback. Get those wrong, and you build yourself a snow trap instead of a snow catch. Marit bought the whips. Nils Brecke was the first to question her. He was 36, Norwegian like Marit, with a wife, 3 children, and 2 milk cows on a claim 2 miles east. He was not cruel. He was practical in the way that men who have survived 3 Nebraska winters become practical by doing what everyone else does, because what everyone else does has been tested by the dead. He found Marit planting the first row of the inner apron on a cold October morning. She was on her knees in the dirt, setting whips into holes she had punched with a borrowed dibble, tamping soil around each root ball with her fist. Randy carried the next whip from the bundle. Tullough sat on an overturned bucket and counted stakes. What are you building? Niels asked. A hedge. A hedge is for cattle in 4 years, not children in 4 months. Marit set another whip and tamped it. Then I need it to be a hedge for the wind before it is a hedge for cattle. Niels looked at the row. He looked at the treeless prairie stretching north and west. He looked at the cabin with its unfinished north wall and its single cord of cottonwood and its stovepipe leaking smoke in a thin gray thread. You have 8 weeks before the ground freezes hard, he said, less if October turns early. You're spending those weeks planting thorns instead of cutting wood. I know. Marit, you have children. I know that too. He left without helping. Marit watched him walk back toward his wagon and saw his wife watching from the seat. She could not hear what Niels said to her, but she saw the woman shake her head slowly, the way people shake their heads when they have already decided something is over. The mockery spread the way gossip spreads in small places, not through malice, but through the simple human need to talk about things that do not make sense. At the seed shed in Beatrice, a ranch hand picked up one of the leftover Osage cuttings and turned it in his hand, grinning. She's planting a porcupine pen, he said. 2 men laughed. A third shook his head and said nothing. At the church steps after Sunday meeting, a woman told Marit that children could not eat hedge apples. Another woman, older, touched Marit's arm and said she would take Randy into town until Marit came to her senses. Marit thanked her and walked home. Chisholm heard about the hedge from his hired man and rode out to see it for himself. He arrived while Marit was soaking roots in a wash tub near the cabin, preparing the next day's planting. Bernd sat on the wagon bed behind her, whittling stakes. Chisholm looked at the rows of small, thorny whips standing crookedly in the dirt. Some were no taller than Tollef. None looked like anything that could stop wind, snow, or a determined cow. "You think thorns make a roof?" Chisholm said. "No," Marit said. "I think wind obeys what it strikes." "Wind obeys God and no widow." Bernd did not look up from his whittling. He said, "Then God has been kind enough to leave her branches." Chisholm's jaw tightened. He looked at the thorn rows and saw something else. The line of whips cut across the informal path his cattle used to cross Marit's quarter section between his summer pasture and his winter range. If the hedge grew, his cattle could not cross. If it thickened with brush, the path would close entirely. "That line crosses my stock trail," Chisholm said. "It crosses my claim," Marit said. "Your stock has no trail on my claim." Chisholm looked at Bernd. He looked at Marit. He looked at the two children sitting in the doorway of the cabin, watching him with eyes that were too old for their faces. "The offer was $40, Chisholm said. "It drops in November." He turned his horse and rode north. Marit stood with water dripping from the whip roots in her hand. She could feel the arithmetic pressing against her ribs. $9 spent on hedge stock, 8 days of labor already gone. Orrin thought she was doomed. Niels thought she was foolish. The town thought she was building a porcupine pen. And the man who held her husband's debt note wanted her to fail badly enough to ride out and watch. But the chaff had landed cleanly behind burnt, staggered sticks. The air on the lee side of her mother's willow hurdle had been still, and the south wall of her cabin, the one with the sod bank, did not leak wind. She set the next whip into the soaking tub and counted what remained. 47 whips planted, 113 to go, 6 weeks until hard frost, 5 months until the worst of winter, 2 children, 1 woman, and a theory made of thorns. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something people mocked before they understood it? Construction began in earnest the second week of October. Bernd arrived at dawn on a Monday with a borrowed wagon, 4 bundles of whips wrapped in wet burlap, and a hickory-handled spade that had been sharpened so many times the blade was narrow as a tongue. He showed Marit how to heel in the whips so the roots would not dry between planting sessions. He dug a shallow trench in the shade behind the cabin, laid the bundles at an angle with roots buried in damp soil, and covered them with more wet burlap. "Roots breathe," he said. "Dry roots die. Dead roots do not grow in spring. You're planting for 2 seasons at once, this winter's brush and next year's living fence. Kill the roots now, and you start over in March with nothing." He taught 3 skills through demonstration, not words. First, he trimmed broken root ends cleanly with a sharp knife, cutting at an angle so the wound would heal rather than rot. He made Marit do it 6 times before he nodded. Second, he showed her how to set each whip at a slight inward lean so that as the rows grew, the branches would tangle into each other rather than growing apart. Third, he demonstrated tamping, not the fist-packing Marit had been doing, but a heel-and-toe compression that pressed soil against the root ball without crushing it. "Air pockets freeze," Bernd said. "Frozen air around a root is worse than frozen soil. The soil insulates. The air kills." He made her redo the first 5 plantings. She did not argue. Her hands ached. Her knees were raw from kneeling in the cold dirt, and the wind pressed against her back as if reminding her that it was still there, still running, still free. By the end of the first day, they had planted 23 whips in the outermost windward row, 75 feet northwest of the cabin. The whips looked absurd, knee-high sticks with thorns, leaning slightly inward, standing in bare dirt with the whole Nebraska sky pressing down on them. A meadowlark landed on one and bent it to the ground. Marit looked at the row and felt something collapse in her chest. Not hope. She did not have enough hope to lose. Something smaller. The belief that what she was doing could be seen. From where she stood, the whips were invisible against the prairie. The wind would not even notice them. Burnt saw her face. He did not offer comfort. He pointed at the base of the nearest whip, where he had piled a small mound of creek clay around the stem. "That is not for you to see," he said. "That is for the wind to hit. By December, there will be dead brush woven through the lower 3 feet. The brush is the winter wall. The roots are the spring wall. You are building 2 things at once, and you will only see one of them until April." That night, Marit's hands were so swollen from thorns that she could not close them around the stove handle. She dipped her fingers in cold water and waited until the swelling eased enough to sew flour sacks into root wraps for the next day's planting. Randy sat beside her and tied strips of cloth to mark the spots where whips had tilted. Tulliff counted the rows from his blanket like prayers. North 1, north 2, north 3. Outside, the wind ran flat across the prairie and hit the cabin wall without slowing down. Inside, Marit listened to it and tried to hear the difference that was not there yet. The second week brought a setback that cost her a full day. The goat chewed through its tether overnight and found the soaking trench behind the cabin. By morning, 24 whips had been stripped of bark and root tips. The goat stood among the wreckage, chewing a piece of wet burlap with the calm indifference of an animal that does not understand consequences. Marit wept, not in front of the children, behind the cabin, where the ruined whips lay in the dirt like stripped bones. She wept because 24 whips was nearly a full row, and a full row was 2 days of labor, and 2 days was time she did not have. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, retied the goat with a double knot to the cabin's corner post, and replanted at lantern light. The season was closing like a hand. Each morning, the frost line crept farther south across the yard. Each evening, the light died earlier. Marit could feel October running out the way water runs out of a cracked jar, not fast, but steady, and impossible to stop. Bernd came every other day through the 2nd and 3rd weeks of October. He arrived before the children woke, his boots already muddy from the walk, and he left when the light turned copper on the western grass. He never said good morning. He said things like, "The east row is leaning," or "You tamped too hard on the end stakes." And then he picked up the dibble and started working. He taught Marit to read the dirt. Soil that crumbled when she squeezed it was too dry for planting. The roots would desiccate before the first freeze locked moisture in. Soil that held its shape but broke cleanly when she pressed her thumb through it was ready. Soil that stayed in a ball and shone wet on the surface was too heavy. It would suffocate roots and rot them from below. "Every whip you plant is a question," Bernd said. "Will this one live?" You cannot answer that question in October. You answer it in April. But you can improve the odds by giving every root the same chance. Clean cut, right angle, right depth, right soil. The ones that die will die because of winter, not because of you. Randy learned to string the arc with twine. She walked the outer row with a ball of cotton string, tying each stake to the next so the line held true against the wind. She did not complain. She did not ask why. She worked the way children work when they understand that the work is not a chore, but a thing their family needs to survive, even if they cannot name what survival means. Tulliff carried stakes. He was 6, and the stakes were taller than he was, and he dragged them through the grass with both hands, leaving thin trails in the dirt like the tracks of a slow animal. He fell asleep beside the water bucket most afternoons and woke with grass pressed into his cheek. On the third Thursday, Niels Brekke's wife sent him with a pot of coffee and a jar of sorghum. Niels stood at the edge of the outer row and watched Marit work for 10 minutes before he set the coffee down and picked up a spade. "I still think this is foolish," he said. "I know," Marit said. He worked for one afternoon. He dug 18 holes, set 11 whips, and tamped them with the heel and toe method Bernd had taught. He did not speak again until he was leaving. Then he looked at the 3 staggered rows taking shape in the dirt, the outermost at 90 feet, the middle at 86, the innermost at 82, and shook his head. "If this works," Niels said, "it will be because God loves fools." "If this works," Marit said, "it will be because wind obeys what it strikes." The first setback after the goat had been the lost whips. The second came in the 4th week, when a hot, dry wind blew out of the south for 2 days and wilted the east row. The whips that Marit had planted first, the ones with the smallest root balls, the ones she had tamped with her fists before Bernd taught her better, drooped and turned gray at the tips. 7 of them shed their bark in papery strips that blew across the yard like dead skin. Bernd examined the row and said nothing for a long time. Then he walked to the creek bed a quarter-mile south, filled 2 buckets with heavy gray clay, and showed Marit how to mulch. He packed creek clay around the base of each wilting whip, forming a collar 2 inches thick and 4 inches wide. The clay held moisture against the stem and reflected heat away from the roots. "This is not medicine," he said. "This is time. You're buying the roots 3 more weeks. If they take hold before hard freeze, the clay saved them. If they do not, nothing would have saved them." Marit spent 2 days hauling clay from the creek. Her arms ached from the bucket handles. Her shoulders burned. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, and at night she ate half portions so the children could eat full ones. Randy noticed. Randy always noticed. "Mama, you did not finish your plate." "I am not hungry." "You are always hungry. You just do not eat." Marit looked at her daughter and saw Oddmund's eyes, the same flat, clear gaze that saw through evasion the way light passes through water. She ate the rest of the cornmeal and said nothing. The third setback was not weather. It was Chisholm. Marit found it on a Tuesday morning in the last week of October. She walked the outer row the way she walked it every morning, counting whips, checking stakes, looking for tilt or damage, and found a gap in the northwestern section wide enough for 2 horses to walk through abreast. 4 stakes had been pulled from the ground and thrown aside. 3 whips were snapped at the base. The dirt showed hoof prints, shod hooves, heavy animals, driven through in a line. Chisholm's hired man had cut a path through the hedge for cattle. Marit stood in the gap and felt something shift inside her. Not anger, something colder, something that sat behind anger the way bone sits behind skin. She knelt and picked up the broken whips. The roots were torn. The bark was peeled. They could not be replanted. She did not ride to Chisholm's ranch. She did not send word. She walked to the soaking trench, pulled 3 replacement whips from the reserve bundle, and replanted the gap by noon. She drove the new stakes deeper, 8 inches instead of 6, and wove dead thorn brush through the lower section so thickly that a man on foot would think twice before pushing through. Bernd arrived that afternoon and saw the fresh planting. He looked at the hoof prints in the dirt around the gap. He looked at the thrown stakes. He said, "That man will do this again." "Then I will replant again," Marit said. "You do not have unlimited whips." "I have enough stubbornness." Bernd did not smile, but something changed in his face, a settling, a recognition. He had seen this before, not in Merite, in the Osage Orange itself, a tree that grows thorns to protect what it needs, a tree that regrows when it is cut, a tree that has been underestimated by every farmer who ever planted it and survived every farmer who ever tried to kill it. He sat on the wagon bed and told Marit about railroad cuts. In 1873, he had helped plant a windbreak along a section of track near Grand Island where snow drifted across the rails every winter. The railroad wanted a solid board fence. Bernd had argued for staggered hedgerows. The foreman overruled him and built the boards. That winter, snow piled over the boards and buried the track under 8 feet of packed drift. The wind had curled over the solid barrier and dropped its load directly on the rails. The next year, they tore the boards out and planted hedgerows with 40% gaps. The snow landed in a ridge 20 feet from the track. The rails stayed clear. "Do not fight the whole storm," Barrett said. "Change the first 30 seconds of its path. Make it drop what it carries where you want it, not where it wants to go. That is the only argument you can win against the wind." He paused. Then he added something that made Marit's hands go still. "But understand this. If you plant too solid, if you fill every gap with brush until nothing passes through, you will make the wind jump. It will go over your wall instead of through it. And when it comes down on the other side, it will drop everything it carried onto your roof. A wrong hedge is worse than no hedge." Marit looked at the rows. She looked at the brush she had woven so thickly through the gap. She walked to the mended section and pulled out every third handful of thorn brush, opening narrow gaps, fist-wide spaces between the woven stems. The wind passed through the gaps and came out slower on the other side. "How do I know if it is right?" she asked. "You throw chaff," Bernd said, "and you watch where it lands." October ended with the kind of day that feels like a door closing. The sky went white at noon. The temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 22 between sunrise and sunset. The grass turned from brown to gray, and the ground made a sound underfoot that Marit had not heard since Norway, the low, tight creak of soil that is freezing from the surface down. The first real blow came that evening. Not a blizzard, a hard northwest wind carrying dust and dry snow. The kind of wind that tests everything without destroying anything. It crossed the open prairie at what felt like 40 miles an hour and hit the unfinished hedge at an angle. Marit stood in the cabin doorway and watched. The hedge was not yet what it would become. The whips were bare sticks with thorns. The brush was thin in places, thick in others. The outer row was complete, the middle row 3/4 done, the inner row barely started. It was a half-built thing facing a full-strength wind. The wind hit the outer row and split. Some of it passed through the gaps. Some of it curled around the ends. The dust and dry snow that the wind carried behaved differently on either side. On the windward face, dust piled against the brush in a thin brown line. On the lee side, the air moved, but it moved slower. The dust that made it through settled in a ragged strip 10 feet behind the row. None of it reached the cabin. Marit walked to the windward side and marked the dust line with a stick. She walked to the lee side and marked that line too. The distance between the two marks was 11 feet. 11 feet of space where the wind had dropped what it carried. It was not proof. A dust line in a hard blow is not a snowdrift in a blizzard. But it was evidence. The first evidence that the principle worked, that a porous barrier could make moving air lay down its load. The town did not see it that way. At the feed store the next week, Orrin Phelps told a group of men that the widow Tivate's thorn rows had caught nothing but tumbleweeds. Chisholm's hired man said the hedge looked like a scarecrow fence for a garden nobody planted. The laughter was not loud, but it carried, the way laughter carries in small places where everyone knows everyone's name and everyone's failure. But Niels Brecke had driven past the claim that afternoon. He had stopped his wagon and stared at the dust line for longer than a man stares at something he does not believe. He did not speak to Marit. He did not wave. He sat on his wagon seat and looked at the line of white dust lying on the lee side of her thorny, half-finished, ridiculous hedge. And then he drove home. By mid-November, the system was complete enough to stand. 3 rows on the windward arc, brush woven low through the lower 3 feet, a 30-foot inner thorn apron, shutters patched from crate boards, and a narrow lee path from cabin to goat shelter, cleared and staked with rope guides. The northwestern corner was doubled with extra brush, as the design required. Gaps were flagged with strips of flour sack so Marit could find weak spots after a blow. She had 2 1/4 cords of wood, not the 5 Oren demanded, not the 6 a prudent man would want. 2 1/4 cords for 5 months, and the entire wager resting on the theory that less wind meant less fuel. The stovepipe leaked smoke in hard gusts. The north wall was chinked with mud and straw, but still not trustworthy in a sustained blow. The goat shelter was a lean-to made from salvaged boards and covered with a canvas tarp that would not survive a direct hit from anything stronger than a November gust. But the hedge stood. In a 2-inch snow in the second week of November, Marit saw the first real performance. The open prairie scoured bare. Wind swept the thin snow cover across the grass like flour across a table, leaving nothing but frozen stubble. Behind the hedge, a white ridge formed along the windward face of the outer row. The ridge was 9 inches deep at the center and tapered to nothing at the ends. Behind the ridge, inside the protected arc, the snow lay evenly on the ground, 1 inch deep, undisturbed. The cabin yard was oddly quiet, not warm, quiet. The wind was still there, still audible, still pressing against the world beyond the hedge. But inside the ark, it had lost its voice. Bernd came that afternoon with a willow measuring stick. He pushed it into the drift at the outer row, 9 inches. He walked to the cabin wall and pushed it into the snow there, 1 inch. He looked at Marit and said nothing, but he wrote the numbers on the stick with a piece of charcoal. Orrin Phelps heard about the measurement from Niels, who had heard it from Barent. Orrin rode out to see for himself. He looked at the drift, looked at the cabin, looked at the 9-inch mark on the willow stick. A November dusting is not a blizzard, Orrin said. 2 inches of snow does not prove anything except that 2 inches of snow fell. It fell where I asked it to fall, Marit said. Orrin did not reply. He mounted his horse and rode back toward Beatrice, but he rode slowly, and twice he looked over his shoulder at the white ridge lying along the windward side of Marit's thorny, ugly, improbable wall. Bernd coughed blood into a rag on the 3rd day after the measurement. He turned away from Marit and folded the rag into his coat pocket, but she saw the stain, dark, not bright, which meant it came from deep inside. He did not mention it. He walked the hedge line that afternoon and pointed out 3 places where brush had shifted in the last blow. He showed Marit how to rewire the bundles using twisted grass rope. He checked the doubled northwestern corner and said it needed 1 more row of dead brush to bring it to the right density. Then he said something that did not match the rest of the conversation. Widen the emergency gap on the southeast side. Marit looked at him. The southeast gap was a 3-foot opening in the inner thorn apron, the only place where a person could walk out of the protected yard without pushing through brush. She had kept it narrow on purpose. Every gap was a place where wind could enter. If I widen it, I weaken the circle, she said. You widen it because snow may seal the main gate on the northwest side. If the big drift builds where you want it to build, the northwestern entry will be buried. You need a way out that the storm cannot close. That feels like giving up ground. Burnt stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not patience, but something between them. The look of a man who has one important thing left to teach and is not certain he will be present to teach it again. Every fortress needs a way out, he said. A wall that traps you inside is not protection. It is a tomb. Marit widened the gap to 5 feet and staked it with 2 posts wrapped in flour sack strips. She did not understand yet why Burnt had pressed the point so hard. She would understand later. The crisis came in December, on a day that began with silence. Marit noticed the silence first in the animals. The goat pressed itself against the south wall of the shelter and would not eat. A flock of crows that had been working the cornfield stubble a quarter-mile east lifted all at once and flew south in a ragged line, fast, without circling. The grass did not move. The air sat on the prairie like a held breath. By mid-morning, the smoke from the stovepipe rose straight up, then bent, then flattened against the roof. Marit watched it and felt the pressure change in her ears. A dull ache behind her jaw, the kind of ache that comes before something breaks. The horizon disappeared at noon. Not gradually, it was there, and then it was not. A gray wall rose in the northwest, solid as a building, and it moved across the prairie with the sound of a freight train running on dirt instead of rails. Marit pulled the children inside, barred the door, and fed the stove 2 splits of cottonwood. The storm hit the claim at 12:40 by the clock on the shelf, which Marit wound every morning because knowing the time was one of the few things she could still control. The sound was the first thing, not wind, a scream. A high, sustained, unwavering scream that came from every direction at once, as if the air itself had been torn open and could not close. The cabin walls shuddered. The stovepipe rattled in its collar. Powder snow forced through the north wall chinks in thin white jets, like steam from a kettle turned sideways. Tullif pressed against Marit's leg. He was hot. She put her hand on his forehead and felt the fever before she understood it, the dry, tight heat of a child whose body is fighting something it cannot name. He had been coughing for 2 days. She had told herself it was dust. It was not dust. "Mama," Randy said, "the lamp." The lamp flame had been guttering since the storm hit. Now it steadied. Marit looked at it and did not understand for a moment. The flame should have been flickering in the draft from the north wall. Instead, it burned straight. She pressed her palm against the north boards. Cold, yes, but still. The air was not moving through the chinks the way it had moved in October. The jets of powder snow had slowed to a seep. Something outside had changed. Marit cracked the south-facing shutter, the lee side, away from the wind, and looked out through the gap. She could see nothing but white, but she could hear the difference. The scream was still there, enormous and constant, but it was farther away. It was coming from beyond the hedge, not from the cabin wall. The wind was hitting something before it reached her door, and that something was slowing it down. She closed the shutter. She fed the stove. She held Tullif against her chest and felt his fever burn through her shirt. The cabin was not warm. She could see her breath in the lamplight, but the stove was holding. The 2 splits of cottonwood were lasting longer than they should have. The heat was staying in the room instead of being pulled out through the north wall by a current that was no longer there. The first hour passed. The second hour began. In the second hour, the wind found the weak corner. Marit heard it before she saw it. A change in the sound. A new note inside the scream, lower and more ragged like fabric tearing. She opened the south shutter again and saw snow moving laterally across the yard, coming from the northwest, cutting through the protected space in a white streak that should not have been there. The northwestern corner, the doubled section. Something had broken through. She learned later what had happened. Chisholm's cattle, blinded by snow and driven before the wind, had drifted south across the open prairie in a stumbling mass. 2 steers hit the outer hedge at the same gap Chisholm's hired man had cut in October. The gap Marit had replanted with deeper stakes and thicker brush. The animals crashed through the brush, snapped the replacement whips, and tangled in the dead thorn weave. One steer fought free and staggered into the open. The other stood caught in the thorns, bellowing, while snow packed around its legs. The gap they made was 8 feet wide, 8 feet of nothing between the storm and the cabin. Snow poured through the breach like water through a broken levee. It streaked across the yard and began piling against the goat shelter. In 15 minutes, a drift 2 feet deep formed against the shelter's north side. The goat screamed inside, a sound Marit could hear over the wind, which meant the goat was close to panic. Stay with this story, because the next few minutes decide whether the wall saves the cabin or seals them inside. Marit did not make a decision. She made a motion. She pulled her coat from the peg, tied a rope around her waist, handed the other end to Randy, and said 3 words: "Do not let go." She opened the door into the storm. The world outside was not a world. It was a white absence. No ground, no sky, no horizon, no direction. The wind hit her chest like a shoved plank and drove her back a step. Snow filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She turned her face sideways and breathed through the gap between her collar and her jaw. She could not see the hedge. She could not see the goat shelter. She could see the rope in her hand and the snow driving past it in horizontal sheets. She leaned into the wind and walked northwest, counting steps the way a blind woman counts the distance to a door she knows is there. 12 steps to the shelter. She found it by touch, the rough edge of the canvas tarp, the wooden frame shuddering under the wind load. The goat pressed against her legs. She tied its tether to her belt and kept walking. 20 more steps northwest. The snow deepened. She was wading now, thigh deep in fresh drift, and the wind was stronger here. She had crossed out of the hedge's protection into the raw blast. The breach was close. She found it by sound. The wind screamed differently through the gap, a focused, channeled howl that was louder and sharper than the diffuse roar around it. She turned her body into the howl and felt snow drive into her face like thrown sand. She had brought a bundle of dead thorn brush under her arm. She had cut it that morning from the reserve pile behind the cabin, not knowing why, only knowing that reserves existed to be used. Now she drove 2 stakes into the snow with the back of the axe she carried in her right hand. The stakes went in crooked. She did not care. She jammed the thorn brush between them and felt the wind shove snow against her shoulder. The snow piled against the brush. She could feel it building, not see it, feel it. The weight of snow pressing against the thorns, the wind's force transmitted through the dead branches into her arms. The brush was catching the drift. It was working, but it was too solid. She remembered Burnt's warning, too thick and the wind jumps. She pulled out 3 handfuls of brush, leaving fist-wide gaps between the stems. The wind passed through the gaps and came out slower on the other side. The snow kept building against the windward face, but the air behind the patch calmed. She remembered the chaff demonstration. She remembered the 3 sticks in the dirt. She remembered Burnt saying, "A solid wall makes a fight." She left the gaps. It took her 20 minutes to fill the breach. She worked by touch, by sound, by the pressure of snow against her body. Her hands were numb before she finished the first stake. Her coat was crusted white. The rope around her waist pulled taut twice, Randy testing, making sure her mother was still on the other end. When she crawled back through the door, she could not stand. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and shook. Not from cold, from the effort of holding herself upright against a force that wanted her flat, wanted her buried, wanted her gone. Tolef was asleep on the cot. His fever had not broken. Randy stood holding the rope end with both hands, her knuckles white, her face the color of ash. "Is it closed?" Randy asked. "It is closed." The lamp flame burned straight. The night divided itself into sounds. The first sound was the wind, constant and enormous, a sound that had no beginning and no end, like the inside of a drum being struck forever. The second sound was the stove, the tick of iron expanding, the soft collapse of embers settling, the whisper of draft through the pipe. The third sound was Tolef's breathing, ragged and wet, the sound of a chest working harder than a chest should work. Marit fed the stove every 90 minutes, 2 splits each time. She had calculated 2 1/4 cords, 7 splits to the hour in a hard blow, and she was burning 4. The hedge was saving her 3 splits an hour. 3 splits an hour for a night that could last 12 hours was 36 splits. 36 splits was nearly a quarter cord. A quarter cord was the difference between running out in February and lasting until March. She pressed her palm against the north wall at midnight. Cold, but still. No draft, no jets of powder. The wind was still screaming, but it was screaming at the hedge, not at the cabin. The hedge was taking the blow. Outside, the snow was building where it was supposed to build. Marit could not see it, but she could hear the wind's pitch changing as the drift grew, the scream rising slightly as the effective height of the barrier increased, the sound of air being forced upward over a growing wall of packed snow. Every inch of drift was another inch of wind shadow. The storm was building its own prison. At the Brecca place, 2 miles east, there was no hedge. Niels had stacked hay against the north side of his cow shed, as Oren had recommended. The wind stripped the hay in the first hour and buried it under 3 feet of drift. The cow shed door jammed under snow load. Niels spent 4 hours chopping through packed snow with a hand axe to reach his animals. Bernd was there. He had gone to help Niels bank the shed 2 days before the storm and had been trapped when the blizzard hit. At some point in the night, Niels would not say exactly when, Bernd collapsed while swinging the axe. He went down on one knee, pressed his hand against his chest, and said, "The lungs are finished." Niels carried him inside and laid him near the stove, where Bernt's wife wrapped him in every blanket they had. At Chisholm's cattle lot, 3 miles north, the cattle that had not already drifted south were piled against the wire fence. The animals stood packed together, heads down, their backs crusted with ice. One hired man tried to cross the 30 yards between the barn and the main house and crawled the last 15 on his hands and knees. He later said he could not feel his feet for 2 days. The storm lasted 31 hours. It left drifts 10 to 15 feet deep in open country. It buried fence lines, wagon roads, and one schoolhouse door up to the lintel. It killed cattle by the hundreds across Gage County and the counties north. It froze water in barrels, cracked axles, collapsed roofs that had not been banked, and turned every unprotected building on the prairie into a wind tunnel that sucked heat faster than any stove could replace it. At Merritt Tveit's claim, the storm built a white rampart along the windward side of the Osage Orange hedge. The drift rose 10 feet at the deepest point on the northwestern corner, the doubled section, the section she had patched in the dark with thorn brush and an axe. Along the east side, the drift tapered to 4 feet. Inside the protected arc, Between the hedge and the cabin, the snow lay 18 inches deep and level. No drifts against the walls, no powder through the chinks, no ice on the inside of the windows. The stove held the cabin at 50 degrees through the night. Not warm, not comfortable, but alive. 50 degrees in a cabin that should have been 25. 50 degrees on 2 splits an hour instead of 7. 50 degrees because the wind had spent itself against a wall of thorns and dead brush and crooked stakes before it reached the door. Morning came gray and still. Marit opened the inner door and heard silence. Not the absence of sound, the presence of quiet. The wind had stopped. The snow had stopped. The world outside the cabin was white and motionless, and the air in the protected yard did not move. She opened the outer door. The goat shelter stood. The rope line to the southeast gap was buried but findable. The inner thorn apron was crusted with ice but upright, and beyond it, where the hedge had stood, a white wall, 10 feet high at the crest, solid, glittering in the pale morning light. The snow had landed where she asked it to land. The wind had spent itself where she asked it to spend itself. The cabin stood in the lee, in the quiet, in the still air that her mother had pressed her hand against 30 years ago on the other side of the world. Tollef's fever broke at dawn. He opened his eyes and said, "Is it morning?" "It is morning," Marit said. Orrin Phelps arrived on snowshoes 2 days after the storm broke. He came from the south, following the road that had been a road before the snow turned it into a white trench, and he carried a fence rail across his shoulders like a yoke. He had come expecting to dig. He told Merritt later that he had dug out 3 homesteads that morning. 2 families had lost their stovepipes to snow load. One had lost a milk cow that froze standing up in a drift against the barn wall. He had seen roofs buckled, doors buried to the lintel, and one cabin where the family had burned their table and 2 chairs to keep the stove fed through the second night. He did not expect to find Marit's door free. He did not expect to see smoke rising straight from her stovepipe in the still air. He did not expect the children to be standing in the yard, alive, dressed, watching him approach with eyes that were tired but not frightened. He stopped at the edge of the inner thorn apron and looked at the snow wall. The drift along the windward hedge rose 10 feet at its deepest point on the northwestern corner. It tapered along the east side to 4 feet. The crest was sharp and clean, sculpted by the wind into a ridge that looked deliberate, as if someone had measured where the snow should land and the storm had obeyed. Inside the protected arc, the snow lay 18 inches deep and level, no drifts against the cabin walls, no ice ridges climbing the north boards. The path to the goat shelter was passable. The goat was alive. The children were alive. The woman who owned less than 2¼ cords of wood had survived a 31-hour blizzard that had killed cattle, collapsed roofs, and frozen water in barrels across the county. Orrin set the fence rail against the drift and measured. He pushed it into the snow at the crest and found bottom at 9 feet 8 inches. He pulled it out and walked to the cabin wall. He pushed the rail into the snow there. 18 inches. He stood between the 2 measurements and said nothing for a long time. Marit waited. She did not prompt him. She did not point at the numbers or repeat the things she had said in October. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and let the measurements speak. "I told you 6 cords," Orrin said. "I had 2¼ Orrin looked at the hedge, the thorns crusted with ice, the dead brush packed with snow on the windward face, the stakes leaning but holding, the whole improbable structure standing between the prairie and the cabin like a frozen argument that had been won. "Then it was not wood that carried you," he said. He did not apologize. He did not say he had been wrong. He said something better. He asked a question. How far from the barn should a man put the first row? Marit answered him. She drew the wind direction in the snow with the heel of her boot and explained the setback, 75 to 90 feet from the building you want to protect, depending on the angle of the prevailing wind. She explained the stagger, 3 rows, 4 feet apart, with the whips offset so no gap in one row aligned with a gap in the next. She explained the density, 50 to 60%, thick enough to slow the wind but open enough to let it pass, so the snow dropped on the windward side instead of curling over the top. Oren listened the way a man listens when the information is more important than his pride. He asked 3 questions. Each one was specific. Each one showed he understood the principle. Marit answered all 3, and when she finished, Oren nodded once, picked up his fence rail, and walked back toward the road. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. He had come expecting to dig out a dead family, and instead he had learned something that might save the next one. Niels Brecke came the following afternoon. He came on foot because his wagon was buried to the axle hubs behind his barn, and he came alone because his wife was watching the children and the cow that had survived because Bernd had helped bank the shed before the storm. He walked the hedge line without speaking. He touched the frozen brush with his bare hand. He pushed his boot into the drift at the outer row and felt the packed snow resist like compacted earth. He walked inside the protected ark and stood where the air was still, where it had been still during the storm, where the wind had not reached, where the stove had held the cabin at 50 degrees on 4 splits an hour instead of 7. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the hedge. He looked at Marit. I said God loves fools, Niels said. You did. I was the fool. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for instruction. He sat on the chopping block beside the stove and listened while Marit explained the system, not the theory, the practice. Where to dig the trench, how deep to set the whips, how to trim the roots, how to tamp without crushing, how to weave the dead brush for winter density, how to leave the gaps. The gaps are the hardest part, Marit said. Every part of you wants to fill them. You look at a hole in your wall and you want to close it, but the wind needs somewhere to go. If you close every hole, the wind goes over the top and drops everything on your roof. Niels wrote nothing down. He did not need to. He had spent 3 winters watching the wind destroy things he built, and now someone was telling him why. The why was simple. He had been building walls. He should have been building filters. Before he left, he asked one more question. Where did you learn this? My mother taught me to feel the lee side of a willow hurdle. Burnt Asen taught me to measure the distance between the wind and the wall. The rest I learned by watching where the dust landed. Niels walked home across the white prairie. The next morning, his wife sent coffee and a jar of plum preserves with a note that said nothing except Marit's name. The community came in 1s and 2s over the following weeks. A farmer from 4 miles south, whose hay barn had collapsed under snow load, asked how far from the barn to set the first row. A woman whose husband had frostbitten 3 fingers crossing 30 yards of open ground between house and privy asked whether a hedge could protect a walkway. A young homesteader who had filed his claim in September and survived the storm in a dugout asked whether Osage Orange would grow on sandy soil. Marit answered every question. She drew diagrams in ash on the stove plate. She walked visitors to the hedge and showed them the drift measurements, the gap spacing, the way the brush was woven. She gave away 6 whips from her reserve bundle to the young homesteader and told him to soak the roots overnight before planting. She did not charge for any of it. She did not trade. She gave the knowledge the way Bernd had given it to her, freely, because the knowledge was not hers to sell. It belonged to the wind, to the physics of moving air, to the principle that a porous barrier could make a storm spend itself before it reached the door. She was only the woman who had planted it in the right place. Chisholm did not come. Chisholm sent a message through the township clerk, that Merritt's hedge had trapped and injured two of his cattle during the storm, and that he intended to pursue damages. The message arrived on a Tuesday. Marit read it and set it on the shelf beside the clock. 2 days later, a teamster named Asa Ketchum arrived at the claim with a mended auger strapped to the side of his wagon. Marit had sent the broken auger to the blacksmith in Beatrice 3 weeks before the storm, and Ketchum, the blacksmith's younger brother, 34, widowed, a wagon repairman by trade, had brought it back because the roads were finally passable. He handed Marit the auger and looked at the hedge. He walked the outer row without being invited, the way a man who works with his hands examines another person's work, not judging, measuring. He touched the stakes. He tested the woven brush. He crouched and looked at the gap spacing from ground level. "Who designed this?" he asked. "I did, with help from a man named Bernd Assen." Ketchum nodded. He looked at the patched northwestern corner, the section Marit had repaired in the dark during the storm, with stakes driven crooked and brush jammed between them by feel. The repair was ugly. The stakes leaned at different angles. The brush was packed unevenly, but it had held. "This corner took a hit," he said. "Cattle, during the storm. And you fixed it in the blow?" "I fixed it because it needed fixing." Ketchum looked at her the way Burnt had looked at her behind the feed store, not with admiration, but with recognition. The recognition of someone who understood that competence was not a gift. It was a decision made under pressure, repeated until it became a habit, and tested until it became proof. He left without saying much more. But he came back the following week with iron hinge straps he had forged for the storm shutters, and he did not charge for them. Burnt did not recover quickly. The collapse at the Breaky cabin had been his lungs, not his heart, and the lungs had been failing for longer than he had admitted. He spent 3 weeks in the Breaka house, coughing into rags that Niels's wife burned in the stove because the blood would not wash out. Marit visited every 4th day, walking the 2 miles with food she could not spare, cornmeal cakes, dried goat meat, a jar of honey she had been saving for Tolof's birthday. She did not visit more often because the claim needed her, and because Burnt would have told her to stop wasting daylight. On her second visit, Burnt asked to see the drift measurements before he asked about his own condition. Marit brought a board she had marked with charcoal, wind direction, broken corner, drift height at 5 points along the arc. Burnt took the board and held it close to his face. His hands shook. He corrected one measurement with a trembling finger, changing the number at the eastern edge from 3 feet to 3.5. "You measured from the base of the drift," he said. "Measure from the ground under the drift." The snow compressed the grass. 1/2 foot of difference. Marit took the correction without argument. She wrote the new number. Then she sat beside his cot and told him about Oren's visit, about the fence rail in the snow, about the question Oren had asked. Burnt closed his eyes and said, "He measures now." "Good." On her 4th visit, they argued. Bernd wanted Marit to add a 4th row to the windward arc, a sacrificial trip row of low willow hurdles set 10 feet in front of the outer hedge, designed to catch the leading edge of a drift before it reached the main barrier. Marit said she did not have the materials or the labor. "You have neighbors now," Bernd said. "I have neighbors who are learning. I do not have neighbors who are ready to build." "Then teach them to be ready." "I am not you, Bernd. I cannot teach the way you taught me." Bernd opened his eyes. "I taught you by making you redo the first 5 whips. You teach by making someone else redo their first 5. The method is the same. The hands are different." The argument ended without resolution, which was how their arguments always ended. Not in agreement, but in a silence that meant both of them would think about it and neither would say so. On her sixth visit, Barent asked Marit to help him stand. She supported his weight, less than it should have been, the bones sharp under her hands, and walked him to the Brecka cabin door. He looked out across the white prairie toward Marit's claim, which he could not see from 2 miles away, but which he looked toward anyway. "I want to see the second-year hedge," he said. "You will see it," Marit said. "I want to see it soon." There was no argument in his voice. There was only time, and the knowledge that he had less of it than the conversation required. Spring came slowly, the way spring comes after a hard winter, not as warmth, but as a gradual loosening, a softening of the air's grip on the ground. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first. The prairie grass emerged brown and flattened, pressed into the earth by months of weight. Water ran in thin sheets across the frozen ground, looking for low places to collect. Burnt died on a Tuesday in late March. He had insisted on seeing the second-year hedge, and Niels had driven him to Marit's claim in a wagon padded with blankets. Burnt walked the outer row with Marit's arm under his, stopping every 10 steps to breathe. He touched the whips that had survived the winter, most of them the ones with clean root cuts and proper tamping, and felt the buds swelling under the bark. At the end of the row, where the northwestern corner had been patched and repaired, Burnt pressed Marit's hand against the lee side of the thorn wall. The air on the windward side still moved. Spring wind, lighter now, but persistent. On the lee side, the air sat. It did not move. It was cool, but not cold, and it carried the smell of wet earth instead of the smell of ice. "Feel what is not moving," Barent said. Marit felt it. The same stillness her mother had shown her. The same quiet air on the lee side of a woven barrier. 30 years and 5,000 miles between the willow hurdle in Voss and the Osage Orange hedge in Gage County, and the principle had not changed. Wind obeys what it strikes. Still air keeps what it holds. Burnt died 4 days later at the Brecka cabin. He did not give a speech. He had given speeches with his hands, with sticks in the dirt, with chaff thrown at barriers, with a shaking finger correcting a measurement on a board. His last words to Niels were about the location of a spade he had borrowed. His last words to Marit had already been spoken, at the end of the hedgerow, with her hand pressed against the thorns. Marit did not attend the burial. She stayed on the claim and planted 12 new whips in the gaps where winter had killed the old ones. She set each one at a slight inward lean, trimmed the roots cleanly, tamped with heel and toe, and left no air pockets. She did not cry while she worked. She cried that night after the children slept, sitting on the floor beside the stove with her back against the south wall, the finished wall, the quiet wall, the wall that Burnt had never needed to fix because the wind had never reached it. The hedge had taken the storm. Burnt had taken the winter. Both had done what they were built to do, and both had cost more than anyone would ever fully measure. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the quiet work is often the work that saves lives. The secondary crisis came in the last week of March, and it came from the same snow that had saved her. The heavy snowpack along the windward hedge began to melt as temperatures climbed above freezing during the day and dropped below at night. Each day's thaw released water. Each night's freeze locked it in place. The drift shrank in layers like a candle burning down, and the water ran downhill toward the cabin, because the cabin sat lower than the hedge line, and because water follows gravity the way wind follows pressure, without negotiation or mercy. Marit noticed the wet ground on a Thursday morning. The soil inside the protected ark was saturated. Water pooled in the ruts left by her boot heels. The path to the goat shelter was mud. By Friday, the meltwater had advanced to within 15 feet of the well. The well was everything. Without clean water, the children could not drink. The goat could not produce milk. Cooking, washing, survival itself depended on a shallow dug well that sat 12 feet from the cabin's south side. If meltwater, woe, carrying soil, animal waste, and whatever the snow had collected during 3 months on the ground, reached the well, the water would be fouled. Fouled water meant sickness. Sickness, with the nearest doctor in Beatrice and the road still half-frozen mud, meant a danger as real as any blizzard. Marit stood at the edge of the advancing melt and felt the old arithmetic return. The same wall that had saved her cabin was now threatening her well. The snow she had asked the wind to deposit was melting where she had asked it to land, and the water was going where water goes, downhill, toward the lowest ground, toward the place where her children drank. She needed Berent. She did not have Berent. She had his lessons, and she had the principle behind them. Do not fight the whole force. Change the first 30 seconds of its path. Wind and water were not the same, but they obeyed the same logic. Both moved along the path of least resistance. Both could be redirected if the barrier was placed correctly. Both punished solid walls and rewarded channels. Marit took the spade, no, the same spade Berent had borrowed and returned, and walked to the uphill edge of the meltwater. She did not try to dam it. A dam would only build pressure until the water found another path, possibly a worse one. Instead, she cut channels. 3 shallow trenches, each 6 inches deep and a foot wide, angled away from the well toward the southeast corner of the claim, where the ground sloped toward a natural draw. The trenches did not block the water. They offered it an easier path. The melt followed the channels the way the wind had followed the hedge, not because it was forced, but because the resistance in every other direction was greater. She worked for 2 days. On the second day, Niels arrived with a shovel and his oldest son. They dug without being asked. Niels understood the principle now, not because Marit had explained it, but because he had watched it work, and the watching had changed the way he saw water, wind, and every other force that crossed a claim. On the third day, Marit used a technique she had never been taught but invented from Berent's principles. She scattered wood ash from the stove across the surface of the snowpack on the eastern side of the drift, the side that faced the morning sun. The dark ash absorbed heat. The snow beneath it melted faster than the snow around it. By directing the ash, she could control which sections of the drift melted first, sending the water toward her channels instead of toward the well. It was not elegant. It was not a method anyone would write down in a manual. It was a woman with a bucket of ashes and a spade, applying the logic of wind barriers to water drainage, making the melt spend itself before it reached the things she needed to protect. The well stayed clean. Chisum's response to the meltwater crisis was not gratitude. It was accusation. His claim lay north and slightly downhill from Marit's, and the drainage channels she had cut sent meltwater across the informal cattle trail that ran between their properties. The trail, the same trail his hired man had cut through the hedge, the same trail his cattle had used to crash the northwestern corner during the storm, was now a shallow creek of muddy snowmelt. Chisum rode to the claim on an April morning with a face like a closed fist. He did not dismount. He looked at the channels, looked at the mud on the trail, and said that Marit had redirected runoff onto his grazing land, and that he would add the damage to the complaint he had already filed about his cattle. Marit stood with the spade in her hand. She was thinner than she had been in October. Her coat was patched in 3 places. Her boots were cracked at the soles. She looked like what she was, a woman who had survived a winter that should have killed her, and who was not finished surviving. "Your cattle broke my hedge during the storm," Marit said. The gap they made nearly cost my children their lives. I patched it in the dark, in a blizzard, by myself. If you want to file a complaint about water on a trail that crosses my claim, you are welcome to explain to the township why your hired man cut the hedge in October." Cheesham's jaw moved. He looked at Niels, who had stopped digging and was watching from the channel line. He looked at Orrin Phelps, who had arrived that morning to ask Marit about setback distances for a windbreak along the township road, and who stood now with his hands in his coat, listening. Two witnesses. Two men who had seen the hoof prints in October. Two men who now understood what the hedge did and what breaking it had nearly cost. Chisholm turned his horse and rode north. He did not mention the complaint again for 3 months, but he did not withdraw it either. It sat in the township records like a thorn in a fence, small, sharp, and waiting. The weeks after the thaw brought people to Marit's claim, the way a well brings people to water. Not all at once, but steadily, and with increasing need. Eli Moen came first. She was 26, widowed the previous autumn, when her husband's horse threw him against a fence post, and she held a claim 4 miles southwest that she could not afford to lose and could not afford to keep. She had survived the storm in a neighbor's root cellar and returned to find her cabin roof sagged under snow weight and her seed stores ruined by meltwater. Marit taught her to heel in hedge plants until the ground warmed enough to plant. She gave Eli 14 whips from the spring nursery stock and drew a windbreak plan on a piece of brown paper, marking the setback, the row spacing, and the prevailing wind direction for Eli's claim. "Your cabin faces east," Marit said. "Your wind comes from the northwest. The hedge goes here." She drew the arc. 75 feet out, 3 rows, 4 feet apart. "But your barn is closer to the north. You need a separate trip row for the barn. Different setback, different angle." Eli listened the way Marit had listened to Bernd, not just to the words, but to the logic behind them. Every farmstead was different. Every layout required its own design. The principle was universal. The application was specific. Marit taught Orrin to test hedge density by throwing chaff. She stood in the wind with him on a breezy afternoon and threw handfuls of dried grass at the hedge from 6 different angles. Where the chaff passed through, the density was too low. Where it piled against the windward face and nothing came through, the density was too high. Where it slowed, settled, and landed in a clean line on the lee side, the density was right. 50 to 60%, Marit said. "You should be able to see light through the hedge. If you cannot see light, the wind cannot see through either, and it will jump." Orrin nodded. He threw chaff 3 more times, adjusting his angle, watching the way the dried grass behaved at each point along the row. He was learning the way old men learn, slowly, carefully, with the pride set aside and the attention fully engaged. Marit taught Randy to map wind by watching where flour dust settled on dark cloth. She spread a piece of black wool on the ground 50 feet from the hedge and threw a handful of flour into the air. The flour drifted on the wind, curled around the hedgerows, and settled on the cloth in a pattern that showed exactly where the air moved fast, where it moved slow, and where it did not move at all. "The blank spots are the quiet places," Marit said. "That is where you want the cabin. That is where you want the well. That is where you want the children to play. The flower shows you what the wind already knows." Randy traced the blank spots with her finger and memorized them. By the end of April, Marit had taught 5 homesteaders the basics of living snow fence design. Not all of them would plant Osage Orange. Some would use willow, which was easier to find along creek beds. Some would use cottonwood cuttings, which grew faster but offered less density. One man planned to use cedar, which he could get from a relative in eastern Nebraska. The species mattered less than the principle: porous barrier, correct setback, staggered rows, right density. The wind did not care what kind of thorn pricked it. The wind cared only about what it struck. Marit stood at the edge of her claim on a May evening and watched the hedge in the last light. The whips were budding. Small green shoots pushed through the bark at every node, tentative and urgent, reaching for the sun the way the roots beneath them reached for water. By next winter, the living wood would thicken. The branches would tangle. The thorns would harden. The dead brush that had served as the winter wall would be replaced by living density, the permanent fence that Barent had promised but not lived to see. She pressed her hand against the lee side of the thorn wall and felt what was not moving. The air sat still. The evening wind crossed the open prairie beyond the hedge and hit the rows and slowed and passed through and came out quiet on the other side. The grass inside the ark did not bend. The cabin smoke rose straight. The children played in the yard without leaning into anything. Summer brought the hedge to life. The whips that had survived the winter pushed green shoots through bark that had looked dead in March. By June, the shoots were 6 inches long. By August, they had branched, tangled, and begun to weave into each other the way Burnt had promised. Inward-leaning stems crossing and catching, forming a lattice work of living wood and thorn that thickened every week. The dead brush that had served as the winter wall was still there, buried inside the growing hedge like bones inside muscle, but it was no longer the primary barrier. The living wood was taking over. Marit replaced the brush where it had rotted or blown loose. She added a low willow hurdle as a sacrificial trip row, 10 feet in front of the outer hedge, the 4th row Bernd had argued for during their last disagreement. She built it not because he had told her to, but because she understood now why he had wanted it. The trip row would catch the leading edge of a drift before it reached the main barrier. It would force the snow to climb twice instead of once. And if the trip row was destroyed by a hard storm, it could be rebuilt in a day. The main hedge would be untouched behind it. She planted cottonwood cuttings farther out, beyond the trip row, in a loose arc that would take years to mature. Cottonwood grew tall. Osage Orange grew dense. The combination, height to lift the wind, density to slow it, would create a compound barrier that improved with every season. Marit would not see its full effect for a decade. She planted it anyway because the woman who plants only for the winter in front of her will always be one winter behind. The nursery took shape behind the cabin. Marit soaked whip cuttings in the wash tub and heeled them into a shaded trench the way Bernd had taught her. She grew more stock than she needed for her own rows, and the surplus became the first currency she had earned since Oddman's death. Not money, exchange. A bundle of 20 whips for a bushel of seed corn, 15 whips for a gallon of lamp oil, 10 whips and a planting lesson for a side of smoked pork from a farmer near the Blue River who had lost his haystack in the December storm and wanted to make sure he never lost another. Randy kept the drift ledger. After every significant snowfall, she walked the hedge with a measuring stick Bernd had marked with charcoal lines and recorded the drift height at 5 points along the arc. She recorded the wind direction, the duration of the blow, and the temperature at dawn and dusk. She did not know she was building a data set. She thought she was helping her mother. She was doing both. Tollef learned to carry heavier stakes. He was 7 now, taller by 2 inches than the boy who had counted rows like prayers, and his hands were tough enough to handle thorn brush without flinching. He did not talk about the storm. He did not talk about the night his fever burned while the wind screamed. He talked about the goat, which he had named Pastor, and about the hedge apples that fell from the maturing branches in September now, green, hard, wrinkled spheres the size of a man's fist that smelled like citrus and could not be eaten by anything except squirrels. Tollef hid hedge apples under his cot. Marit found 7 of them one evening, arranged in a line from largest to smallest, and asked him why. "They are soldiers," Tolef said. "They guard the house." Marit did not correct him. In a way he could not articulate and she could not deny, he was right. Asa Ketchum came back in July with the iron hinge straps he had promised for the storm shutters. He arrived in the morning, before the heat, and spent 3 hours fitting the straps to the window frames. He worked without talking much. He measured twice before he drilled. He asked Marit where the shutters should swing, inward or outward. And when she said outward because inward would block the window when the shutters were open, he nodded and did not argue. He came back in August to repair a cracked runner on the handcart. He came back in September to look at the hedge again, this time with a notebook he had made from stitched brown paper. He sketched the row spacing, the setback distances, and the way the thorn brush was woven through the lower stems. He asked questions that showed he had been thinking about the design between visits, questions about drainage, about the angle of the rows relative to the slope of the ground, about what happened when two hedges on neighboring claims created overlapping wind shadows. "Does the wind know it has already been slowed?" he asked. "The wind does not know anything," Marit said. "But the snow does. It falls where the air stops moving. If two hedges create two quiet zones, the snow falls twice, once at each barrier. Less reaches the cabin." Ketchum wrote that down. He was not a farmer. He was a wagon repairman and a blacksmith's brother, a man who understood iron and wood and the forces that broke them. He understood the hedge because he understood stress, the way a load distributes across a structure, the way a weak point invites failure, the way reinforcement at the right place prevents collapse. He did not court Marit with words. He courted her with work. He reforged her broken mattock. He built a frame for the goat shelter that could be taken down and rebuilt in an afternoon. He asked permission before moving a stake, and when Marit told him the northwestern corner needed new posts, he brought iron posts instead of wooden ones, posts that would not snap if cattle hit them again. In October, a year after Marit had planted the first whip, Ketchum brought a set of iron rings he had forged. They were gate rings, heavy, smooth, designed to hold a swinging panel of woven brush that could open and close the emergency gap on the southeast side. "I can make them swing," he said, "but you know where they belong." Marit took the rings and held them in her hands. They were warm from the forge, heavy as conviction, and they fit the post she had set at the southeast gap. The gap Burnt had told her to widen, the gap that had saved her because it gave her a way out when the storm sealed the northwestern entry. She looked at Ketchum. He was not Odmund. He was not trying to be. He was a man who brought iron rings and asked where they belonged, and who understood that asking was not weakness. It was the recognition that the person who designed the wall knew more about the wall than the person who forged the hinges. "Here," Marit said. She walked to the southeast gap and set the rings against the posts. "The gate swings inward, toward the cabin, so the wind cannot push it open from outside." Ketchum nodded. He drilled the bolt holes that afternoon, and the gate swung smooth and heavy on its iron rings, and the emergency gap became a door instead of a hole. That evening, after the children were asleep, Marit and Ketchum sat on the chopping block beside the south wall and did not talk about the gate. They talked about iron. They talked about the way a forge changes metal, not by adding anything, but by making what is already there find its shape. Marit said the hedge was the same. She had not invented anything. She had taken the wind's own behavior and given it a place to happen. Ketchum said, "That is what a good blacksmith does. You do not make the iron into something new. You make it into what it already wants to be." They sat in the quiet air inside the ark, and the wind crossed the open prairie beyond the hedge and did not reach them. The The second winter tested the hedge differently. The December storms of 1881 were not as severe as the blizzard of the previous year, but they were persistent. 3 blows in 2 weeks, each one lasting 12 to 18 hours, each one adding to the drifts along the windward rows. The hedge held. The trip row caught the leading edge of each drift and forced the snow to climb before it reached the main barrier. The main barrier slowed the wind and dropped the load. The cabin sat in the lee. Marit burned 2 cords of wood that winter instead of the 5 Oren had originally demanded. She had 3.5 cords in the stack and finished April with 1.5 remaining. The surplus was not luxury. It was proof. Proof that less wind meant less fuel, that a porous barrier could cut heat loss by nearly half, and that a woman who measured before she dug could survive on resources that a man who did not measure would consider fatal. Niels became the practical evangelist. He planted his own hedge in the spring of 1881, 3 rows, Osage Orange, 70 feet from his cowshed, and spent the summer weaving brush and arguing with his wife about the setback distance. His wife thought the hedge was too far from the building. Niels told her what Marit had told him. Too close, and the drift lands on the roof. Too far, and the wind recovers its speed before it reaches the wall. The distance is not arbitrary. The distance is the argument. Niels's hedge survived its first winter with a drift 7 feet deep at the outer row and clear ground around the cowshed. He told everyone who would listen. Some listened because they trusted Niels. Some listened because they had survived the 1880 storm in conditions that made them willing to trust anything. Oren began recommending living windbreaks in township road meetings. He did not call them Marit's hedges. He called them thorn breaks and described them as though he had thought of them himself, which Marit found more amusing than insulting. The knowledge was spreading. Who received the credit mattered less than who received the protection. Eli Moen proved up her claim using nursery stock from Marit's reserve. She planted her hedge in the autumn of 1881 and survived the following winter in a cabin that should have been uninhabitable. She was the second woman in the township to hold a claim through a hard winter alone, and she told people that Marit Tveit had given her the method the way you give someone a match, a small thing that makes everything else possible. Chisholm's final reckoning came in the 3rd winter. A January storm in 1883 drove his best bull into a wire fence on the northern edge of his grazing land. The animal was trapped between the wire and a drift that had built against the fence line, the exact condition that the hedge was designed to prevent. The bull could not move forward through the wire. It could not move backward through the drift. It stood in the wind, losing heat, and would have frozen within hours. Chisholm's hired men could not reach the animal. The drift was too deep. The wind was too strong. The fence was too far from the barn for a rope line. Marit, Ketchum, Niels, and Oren arrived because a boy on horseback had ridden to every farm within 3 miles asking for help. They did not come for Chisholm. They came for the animal, because letting an animal die when you could prevent it was not something any of them were willing to carry. Marit looked at the drift and the fence and the wind and saw the problem the way Burnt had taught her to see problems, not as a wall to break through, but as a force to redirect. She told Ketchum to cut the wire 30 feet east of the bull. She told Niels to pile brush in an arc on the windward side of the cut, creating a temporary wind shadow. She told Oren to stand at the opening and wave his coat. The brush slowed the wind at the cut point. The snow stopped building. The bull saw the opening, the place where the air was calm, where the drift was not growing, and stumbled through it. The animal crossed 30 feet of open ground and reached the lee side of Chisholm's barn, where it stood shaking, crusted with ice, alive. Chisholm watched the entire operation from his barn door. He had not asked for help. He had not spoken during the rescue. He had watched 4 people, including the woman whose hedge he had tried to destroy, whose claim he had tried to buy, whose cattle trail he had cut, and whose well he had accused her of fouling, save his best bull using the same logic that had saved her cabin 3 winters earlier. Marit coiled the rope and walked toward her wagon. Chisholm stepped out of the barn doorway and stood in the wind. "I still say it is an ugly fence," he said. Marit turned. She looked at him, at his expensive coat, at his barn that the wind hit without mercy, at his wire fence that trapped cattle instead of protecting them. She said the line that the community would repeat for years. "Then build an ugly one before January." Chisholm did not laugh. He did not nod. He went inside his barn and closed the door. But the following spring, his hired men planted 2 rows of Osage Orange whips along the north side of his cattle lot. They set them at 60 feet from the barn, 4 feet apart, with brush woven through the lower stems. They did not ask Marit for help. They did not need to. They had watched. The complaint about Marit's drainage channels disappeared from the township records. No one withdrew it. It simply was never mentioned again, the way a man's pride sometimes retreats not through admission, but through silence. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the living begins. Marit and Asa Ketchum married in the spring of 1884 in the lee of the hedge, with Randy holding a bouquet of prairie wildflowers and Tolef holding the iron rings he had helped Ketchum set 2 years earlier. The ceremony was brief. The minister was borrowed from the church in Beatrice. The guests were Niels and his wife, Orrin, and his daughter, Eli Moen, and the young homesteader who had received Marit's first 6 whips and now had a hedge of his own. Marit kept the Tavite claim in her name until the patent was granted. Ketchum did not ask her to change it. He built a forge beside the goat shelter and made tools, dibbles for planting, rings for gates, hinge straps for shutters, iron stakes that would not snap in a cattle strike. He made them for Marit's claim and for the neighbors who came to buy or trade, and he stamped each piece with a small mark shaped like a thorn. Tolef learned blacksmithing from Ketchum the way Marit had learned hedgecraft from Burnt, through demonstration, correction, and the patient repetition of things done wrong until they were done right. He made his first iron dibble at age 10. It was crooked. Ketchum made him straighten it, reheat it, and straighten it again. By age 12, Tolef's dibbles were better than Ketchum's, and neither of them mentioned it. Randy kept the drift ledger through her teenage years. The ledger grew into a document that recorded every significant storm, every drift measurement, every wind direction, and every modification Marit made to the hedge system across 8 winters. Randy did not know she was keeping a record of applied physics. She thought she was keeping her mother's notes. The distinction did not matter. The data was real, and it showed the same thing year after year. The drift landed where the hedge asked it to land, and the cabin stood in the quiet air behind it. By 1885, Marit's claim had a mature Osage Orange shelter arc on the north and west, a low willow trip row on the windward side, a cottonwood height screen farther out that was finally tall enough to lift the wind before it reached the dense hedge, a kitchen garden inside the quiet yard that produced vegetables 3 weeks earlier than gardens on unprotected claims, and a teaching nursery of hedge whips that supplied stock to 12 farms in the township. 12 farms. 12 versions of the same idea, adapted to 12 different layouts, 12 different soil types, 12 different relationships between barn, house, well, and wind. Not all of them used Osage Orange. Some used willow, some used cedar, some used a combination. One farmer near the Blue River used nothing but dead brush and replaced it every autumn because he could not afford living stock and could afford labor. It worked. Not as well as a rooted hedge, but well enough that his cabin stayed clear and his fuel lasted, and his children did not wake with snow dust on their blankets. The idea that mattered was not the plant, it was the placement. It was the principle that a porous barrier, set at the right distance, at the right angle, with the right density, could make a storm spend itself before it reached the door. Marit had not invented the principle. The wind had always obeyed it. Bernd had known it. Her mother had known it. The physics had existed since the first air current crossed the first obstacle and slowed. What Marit had done was plant it in the ground and dare the winter to prove her wrong. The later years passed in the rhythm of seasons and hedge growth. Marit pruned the Osage Orange every spring, cutting back the wild shoots, encouraging the lateral branches that thickened the barrier, plashing, bending, and weaving, the older stems into a living lattice so dense that a man could not push through it without tearing his clothes. The hedge became a wall. Not the kind of wall that fights the wind, but the kind that negotiates with it, slowing it, filtering it, taking what it carries and laying it down in the place where it does the least harm. Ketchum built iron frames for the plashed sections, supporting the bent stems until the wood hardened in its new shape. Tolla forged the bolts. Randy mapped the wind shadow with flower dust every spring, tracking the quiet zone as the hedge grew taller and denser, watching the protected area expand year by year like a slow tide of calm. A second child came in 1886, a boy named Bernd, who grew up inside the hedge the way fish grow up inside a reef, never knowing the force that the barrier held at bay. A third child followed in 1889, a girl named Sigrid, who learned to walk in the quiet yard where the grass showed through in winter and the cabin door opened without a shovel. Marit lived on the Gage County claim until she died in 1916, after a spring pruning day when she cut the last of the season's wild shoots and stacked them in the brush pile for next winter's weaving. She was 67. Her hands were scarred from 36 years of thorns. The axe head she had used to pound stakes in the dark during the first blizzard hung on a nail in the forge. Ketchum had sharpened it every year, and every year Marit told him not to, because the nicks in the blade were the record of the night the hedge earned its name. Randy's drift maps were stored in a flour tin on the shelf beside the clock that Marit had wound every morning for 36 years. The clock still ran. The maps still showed the same wind direction, the same drift pattern, the same quiet zone behind the thorns. Physics does not change. Only the people who learn it change, and only if someone shows them where to put their hand. By the time Marit was old, more than a dozen neighboring farms used hedgerows, brush trip rows, or planted windbreak arcs that traced their logic back to the first winter on her claim. Not all copied her method exactly. Some set the rows closer, some set them farther. Some used species she would not have chosen and spacing she would not have recommended. But they survived. Their cabins stood clear, their fuel lasted. Their children grew up in the lee, which was the only measurement that mattered. Marit lived her later years on the same ground where she had knelt in the dirt with swollen hands and planted thorns by lantern light. Randy kept the driftboard. Tollef saved the axe head, the hedge apple that Tollef had hidden under his cot at age 6, the largest of his 7 soldiers, sat dried and brown on the shelf in the forge, light as a wasp nest, still shaped like a fist. A man at the Beatrice seed shed had laughed and called it a porcupine pen. The same road ran past Marit's claim years later, and the hedge stood along it, thick, thorned, bent with the memory of 30 winters, its branches woven so tight that the wind could not pass without paying a toll in speed. Winter crossed the open prairie and struck the old rows. Snow lifted from the ground, slowed against the thorns, and settled in a white ridge where Marit had taught it to settle. Inside the yard, The grass showed through in patches. The cabin door opened without a shovel, and on the windward side, where the storm screamed and the snow drove horizontal, and the air hit the thorn wall with everything the prairie could throw. On the lee side, a hedge apple lay half buried in the drift, green against white, while the wind died in the branches above it and the silence held. The town laughed because Marit Tveit planted thorns. Winter understood she had planted silence,